This is a Nice Guys Patreon exclusive.
Welcome to another NHL team season preview video. 32 teams in 32 days rolls along on the Ice Guys Patreon page. Ian Cameron, Alex B. Smith. And you knew who we'd ask and who we'd recruit for the Minnesota Wild as far as the team preview video. Terry Edelman, Wild Fan Supreme. Terry, welcome in. Excited to talk some Minnesota Wild, and I'm sure excited to see your team back on the ice in a few weeks.
Thanks for having me as always. And again, this might be, we'll get to it throughout the show, but I'm not coming in here with huge expectations. And me, someone who has bet the Wild a lot in recent years, I'm going to be looking at them from a player prop perspective a lot more this year and trying to stay away from the sides with the Wild. So that's my intent to start the season.
It'll be interesting to see, of course, with the Minnesota Wild, what we get. And with that in mind, we begin with looking at the Minnesota Wild, of course, a team that is looking to have a bounce-back campaign, of course, a season that was unfortunately so tough last year that it cost Dean Evason his job. He gets let go during the course of the season. This will be the first full season for John Hines as the head coach of the Minnesota Wild. We'll see how that goes. But when you look at the Minnesota Wild coming into this year from a roster standpoint, there's going to be so much on the shoulders of Kirill the Thrill Kaprizov, obviously, with hope that Matt Zuccarello can have a greater degree of health this year, with hope that Marco Rossi is going to be able to be that legit, potential top-line center that you're kind of hoping that he is for the Minnesota Wild. It's a lot of pressure, and I like Rossi, and I like the evolving of his game last year. There's no doubt. Lots to like there. But is he ready for the role that's going to be asked of him, is going to be the big question this year. Matt Boldy, hopefully you get regular season Boldy. There was a time in the playoffs 2 years ago he kind of struggled, but obviously we know he's a good finisher. You're going to need his offense big time. Joel Eriksson-Ek, getting up there in years, but still a very good two-way center when he's on the ice and healthy. Marcus Johansson, the veteran, still here. Ryan Hartman, one of my favorite players on this team, just because of how hard he works and he can score, as we know, because we took a lot of Hartman props last year, and we know he can get in, score in the tough areas, be physical, drop the gloves every now and then. Marcus Foligno, another favorite of mine on this team, just because of his physical prowess and defending his teammates, and as good as it gets as a teammate, in my opinion. I actually like the addition, a little under the radar, Jakub Lauko from the Boston Bruins here for this Minnesota Wild team. Liked his game. He had a little sandpaper, could finish a little bit as well. And I think a lot is going to be put on Marat Husnudinov here this year for the Minnesota Wild. This is someone that's going to probably get a lot more opportunity with the big club, see if he can be ready to be someone that can contribute and to chip in, 20, 25 goals this year for the Minnesota Wild, so something to keep an eye on. They do have a couple of depth forward options, too, when you're talking about Yakov Trenin, who they bring in, Devin Shore, Travis Boyd as well. So those guys will be competing for, some of the last forward spots in training camp. On the blue line, it feels like I say this for years. If you have a healthy Jonas Brodin, if you have a healthy Jared Spurgeon, big fucking ifs every single year when it comes to the Minnesota Wild, to go with Brock Faber, who obviously had a terrific season last year, was obviously in the hunt for the Calder. You have a good three there with that trio, assuming Spurgeon's healthy, assuming Brodin's healthy, and of course with what Brock Faber showed you last year. Now, I do have questions in the bottom. I mean, Jacob Middleton's slow of foot, ditto Zach Bogosian. You can beat those guys to the net with speed. Their foot speed's just not great. Like if they get caught in the neutral zone on any given opportunity for the opposition, they're in trouble. They're not getting back, either of those guys, Middleton and Bogosian. So you do have a little bit of a lack of foot speed there. You have John Merrill, Declan Chisholm, among others, to fill out the depth on the blue line, but there's big questions in that bottom pair. Don't really love what I see from the Minnesota with the bottom pair, but if you give me a healthy Spurgeon, a healthy Brodin, plus Brock Faber, that's a solid three. It's just after that, I think the quality of depth falls off big time when it comes to this Minnesota Wild blue line. And then in net, you've got obviously the ageless wonder, Marc-Andre Fleury back again, and Flower Power, and Philip Gustafson, who shown you the entire gamut with Minnesota. Had these incredible hot streaks in net for Minnesota, and then times when he couldn't stop a beach ball for Minnesota. So what are you going to get from Philip Gustafson? And look, Fleury, they're going to probably give him, a decent amount of games, like something in maybe the 30, 35 range. We'll see. But it's definitely going to be more of a platoon role, I would think, that John Hines goes with his goaltending. Probably give more starts to the younger goalie, that being Gustafsson. But I'm sure Marc-Andre Fleury is still going to get in there quite a bit. The problem for Minnesota is, they're kind of retooling on the fly. Of course, I also forgot to mention, the guy that is going to be the Brick Wallstedt, as we like to call him, Jesper Wallstedt, waiting in the wings here to become the future in net for the Minnesota Wild. It's just a quick question of how quickly that ends up happening. When I look at Minnesota, there's some things to like, but it's going to be if they suffer any kind of injuries to the top three on the blue line, Faber, Spurgeon, and Brodin, they're in big trouble on the blue line. And if Kaprizov goes down, or if Boldy gets hurt, or if Rossi doesn't pan out in the top line center spot, there's just so many easy to figure, like it's easy to see all that happen. It's easy to see Brodin getting hurt again. It's easy to see Spurgeon getting hurt again because it always happens. It's so many of these things it's easy to see happen that it would make Minnesota infinitely worse, any of these scenarios. And that's what concerns me. You lose any of these players to injury, and you don't have Rossi ready to go in the top line center spot to be offensively and defensively good in that role this year. It could be trouble for the Minnesota Wild, and the depth just isn't there at a lot of key positions. And the fact they play in a division and a conference that's just brutal and tough and difficult, and everyone around them is always pretty good. So I've got them not making the playoffs, and I'm not a big John Hines fan, so I'm going to have to see it before I believe it with him. I just think there's just too many question marks, too many guys that are important to this team that seem to always get hurt, and I worry that happening again. If you can guarantee Kaprizov is healthy, if you can guarantee Brodin, Spurgeon are healthy, and Faber plays at a great sophomore season here, Minnesota could threaten for a wild card. They could. But I think that's where their ceiling is. Threaten for the wild card. If everything breaks right, they maybe slip in. But I think everything is going to have to break right for that to happen, and I'm not sure it's going to. Alex, your thoughts, Minnesota Wild.
Yeah, you said it perfectly. This team's a glass puzzle, meaning that if you take a piece out, it's infinitely weaker. And if you are trying to jam it in a certain way, you end up breaking all the pieces. So, like you said, the ceiling is competing for a wild card. Let's talk about what the basement could be. And the basement may not be the worst thing in the world. Because keep in mind, this is not, like you said, it's not a rebuild, it's a retool. So this is a wild team that's certainly not going to contend for any titles in the next 2 to 3 years. At least 2 years. But you have pieces like Brock Faber. You have 2 more years of Kirill Kaprizov. You have Matt Boldy and Harrison Eck long-term deals. You have these pieces, these core pieces there where you're waiting for some kids to come up from Iowa, and in due time, this will be a contending team. But I think you need to kind of bottom out this year if you're the Wild. And I think, like you said, it only takes a couple things to happen before this team looks like a bottom 5 or bottom 10 contender. And that's where I think they kind of end up this year. With all the talent that they do have up front, it's a lot of streaky guys. Kaprizov's the only guy who's consistent. Joel Eriksson gives you consistent defense every night, but his offense is hot and cold. Ryan Hartman can play anywhere from the first line to the fourth line, but he often finds himself in the third, fourth lines when he's not scoring. You mentioned about Marco Rossi. It's time for him to kind of step up. Matt Zuccarello at 37 years of age, who can another guy who can't really stay healthy for a full year. So you have these pieces that are fragile on the blue end and with Zuccarello, and then you have pieces of inconsistency up front in the top six. That's not a good matchup. And then when you look at the goaltending, and this is the thing, I actually heard this on an interview on another a Wild related podcast. They're interviewing GM Bill Guerin. There's a possibility that they could run 3 goalies because of Jesper Wallstedt. There's not much more he needs to do in the AHL. This guy's NHL ready. But you're not going to obviously sit Marc-Andre Fleury in his final year for a bunch of games, nor are you going to sit Philip Gustafsson, who you haven't signed under contract for the next 2 seasons. So there could be a 3 goalie rotation with Minnesota, which isn't the worst thing in the world, honestly. Obviously, like I said, Flowers going to get a ton of starts, especially late in the year. He's going to do basically his kind of, farewell tour. He's going to start both games against Pittsburgh. He's going to start both games against Vegas. He's going to start the last home game of the season if he's healthy. So those things, and we know these pieces. There's a lot of from a betting standpoint, situational angles and pieces to either fade the Wild or bet on the Wild. Me and Terry were talking off air about how the beginning of the schedule starts, where they have 2 games at home before they go on a 7-game road trip. But that road trip is kind of split. They've got 2 games against Winnipeg and St. Louis to start that trip. Then they have 4 days off before going out to Columbus and going to the East Coast. So we always talk about scheduling throughout the year. Look at how the schedules are laid out, especially this time of year, because you see those, blindly look at a 7-game road trip. Well, there's a little gap in between where early in the year they might be able to deal with that trip a little bit better than you might imagine. So this will be a team to find value in betting on or against throughout the year. I do have some futures that I like because of the fact that I think that they're not a playoff team. I have them to miss the playoffs at plus 130. I have under 95.5 points at minus 120. And I took a flyer on least points in the league at 150 to 1. If they end up having injuries and you end up having, some kind of, different issues and stuff, you make some trades and move some pieces away. Why not? They could end up tanking out completely, being at the bottom of the Central and the bottom of the league and contending and being a lottery pick team. It wouldn't shock me at all if they end up being one of the 5 worst teams in the NHL this season.
They
I
could
also
be
have
hard sellers. Yeah. If
I
like, if
also
they're out of
have
it at the
yeah.
deadline. I agree.
I also have Philip Gustafson under 24.5 wins, and that's predicated on the fact that they might do this 3 goalie rotation. I don't see where anybody gets 20 wins with the team altogether, individually rather, I should say.
Right.
So under 24.5 at minus $1.10 over an MGM, I thought that was a really good bet just off of the fact that Gustafson. The only thing that's dangerous is that if something happens where Gustafson wants to get moved, which that could be a possibility. That could be a scenario if Wallsted's ready and now, let's say, you're not moving Fleury. That's the only thing that kind of jeopardizes that bet. But I still think, more than likely he sticks around the entire year, and they utilize that 3 goalie system maybe later in the season, which means that you just have guys going around where, no one's going to be streaking together 7 or 8 wins on their own.
And of course, last year, when you look at the numbers for Minnesota, as far as offense goes, they were 3.02 goals for per game, 3.17 goals against per game. So slightly worse defensively than they were offensively last year. And to me, that's going to be kind of what they are this year. I think I think it's going to be more of a struggle for them to be a 3 goals or more per game team, but I could definitely see them being a higher than 3 goals per game against team this year, especially again if they start to suffer. If here we go again with fucking Brodin and Spurgeon, I'm telling you, and they get hurt again, that is just, there's zero quality behind the top 3 in my opinion. And you don't want Bogosian, you don't want Middleton having to play 25 minutes a night on the blue line. You just don't. You can't have that happen. And that's what you're going to be concerned about if there's injuries again to Brodin and Spurgeon. And Faber's going to have to carry the load a little bit. Plus Faber, he's still trying to get better and better defensively. We know he's a great skater. He's piling up the points and all that. He's still trying to get better defensively in his zone, doing all the little things. So you can't put all that on his plate. It's imperative they keep Brodin and Spurgeon healthy. Will they is the question. Terry, the mic is yours. The floor is yours. You're Minnesota Wild.
All right. Well, I don't know if you saw my reaction when Alex said that about the Wild finishing last.
I don't think they'll be that bad, but it wouldn't totally shock me. I'll tell you that.
It's a nice plus price, but for me, I can't see that happening. The only way I could see that happening is it would need to take multiple injuries, and then Kaprizov would have to request a trade. If Kaprizov is not going to re-sign with the Wild, Bill Guerin has to do something. He cannot have Marian Gaborik 2.0. If Kaprizov is not going to stay with Minnesota, then Bill Guerin has to move him. Of course, that's not what I want, and I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's the only way I could see them fighting for that last place in the NHL. But looking at the team as a whole here, I did my Wild season preview show, and I was actually one of the people that were a little bit lower on this Wild team. I can't recommend anyone to bet them to make the playoffs at minus 135. And I couldn't ask anyone to bet the point total over either, based on what they did last year. Now, as Ian said, injury questions are huge because last year's results was without Spurgeon pretty much the entire year, and Brodin did miss a lot of time last year. which did put a lot on the shoulders of Brock Faber. But if Spurgeon doesn't miss 75% of the season, and if Jonas Brodin does stay somewhat healthy, that is a strong defense. Jacob Middleton, when Jared Spurgeon is beside him, he plays great. He's a great defenseman. When Jared Spurgeon's not there, he's a bottom pair guy, if that, on some teams. So he needs Jared Spurgeon, Jake Middleton. So yeah, there's a lot of questions with the Wild, and I'm going to make a little bit of a prediction here when it comes to the goaltenders. I predict Philip Gustafson's traded. I think he's gone. He's not going to finish his 2 years with Minnesota. Guerin wanted to re-sign Fleury for one more year. If there wasn't some questions with Gustafson, he doesn't come into camp fit. That's Philip Gustafson's issue, is he comes in out of shape. And Bill Guerin's not the type of guy that's going to tolerate that. If Gustafson gets off to a slow start, then I could definitely see him getting traded. And there's a team like Vancouver, who I'm sure you guys will get to, that has a lot of goaltending issues right now and goaltending question marks when it comes to health. So I can see Philip Gustafson getting moved to a team like Vancouver. So that's one prediction I have, is that Gustafson is moved. And when you do go to player props, or sorry, when you do go to future bets, I absolutely love one player future, and that's Joel Eriksson over 27.5 goals. Last year he had 30, a career season for him, 77 games played. We've seen year after year after year, Joel Eriksson has improved. And whether he's on that top line with Kaprizov or if he's on the second line with Boldy, I like Joel Eriksson. He's a power play guy. He's at the front of the net. He's going to get a bunch of dirty goals like that. 30 last year. I think he replicates last season, or maybe even improves it a bit. So that's my favorite prop.
Just to add to that, 38 and 34 goals for Joel Eriksson the last 2 years. So easily over that number.
Yeah, so I like him. I like him to continue getting hot. So when it comes to the Wild as a whole, I could see them missing the playoffs. I don't have any expectations for them to make the playoffs this year. If Alex is right and it's going to be a down year, then I'm totally fine with that. Another draft pick to put in the hands of Guerin and Judd Brackett. Marcus Johansson, Frederick Gaudreau, those two guys are dead weights on this team. So I'm hoping to see both those guys in the press box. I want to see Liam Ogren get some time in this lineup. Marcus Johansson right now is supposed to be on that second line for the Wild, and if that's the case, then I could definitely see them missing the playoffs. He's a guy that will show up one night, and all of a sudden you're like, "Holy heck! Who is this guy?" He's skating all over the place, and he looks great. And then for 3 weeks after,
why can't I get that every night, right?
Yeah, for 3 weeks after that, you can't find him on the ice. So guys like that, he's got to be in the press box. And that's my thoughts here. I think Gustafson gets moved. I think Eriksson has a great season. But the Wild themselves, I don't know. I don't know what to expect this season.
That is a very loud and clear message from a guy that is usually the eternal optimist when it comes to the Minnesota Wild, Terry Edelman, that bettors beware when it comes to the Minnesota Wild, certainly in terms of any playoff prognostications or any playoff hopes for this team this season. I just think it's going to be tough sledding. Again, they're 1 or 2 injuries away from really having a tough time as far as being able to compete with the blue line and the forward depth of so many of these other great teams across not only the division they're in, but the Western Conference as a whole. And that would concern me. And again, you name me the last season, you've been able to see Brodin and especially Spurgeon stay healthy. and it's been tough. So you're right. Joel Eriksson-Ek's been one of the guys that's not only been able to stay healthy the last 3 years, but the 38 goals, the 34 goals the last 2 years. So I see what Terry's seeing with the over 27.5 goals for JEE.
And the big thing too, I'm here in St. Paul, so I interact with Wild fans consistently. You have to keep the faith. I trust in Bill Guerin. I believe Bill Guerin is arguably one of the best GM this team has ever had, and I trust in what he's going to do with this team. Now, there's certain things like the Fleury signing. I believe that was higher up, the owners that called for that, based off of the fact that if you have Marc-Andre Fleury in his last season, you're going to sell tickets. You're going to have people come out and watch him. You're going to have people travel to see him play, and that's something that you just need to have from an organizational and financial standpoint. But like you said, being open to trading Gustafsson, being open to possibly trading Kaprizov, which I don't think would be the worst idea ever, because next year you get the $14 million that's off the books from Parise and Suter. That goes down to like 1.8, I think, is the cap hit for the next few years after that. And then if you get that $9 million off, and you have a bad enough season where you get a top 5, top 10 pick, the Wild could easily retool. I'm trusting Guerin enough to where if that were the situation to happen, the Wild could be a playoff team as early as next year. Because I do trust in Bill Guerin as a general manager that he's putting things together in the right way, and he could find a way to get 2 guys to replace Kaprizov. You can't find a one to replace him unless you trade straight up and get another top tier player, which that rarely happens these days. Yep. But he could easily find 2 guys and be able to balance the lineup. I think he understands the balance that's necessary for this Minnesota franchise moving forward. So, like I said, even if it's a down year now, brighter times are ahead, I believe, here in St. Paul.
And it's all in Kaprizov's hands, I think. He's going to tell Guerin.
Alpha male Kirill Kaprizov this year. Let's be real. He's got to have that kind of year.
Yeah, and if he wants to test free agency, if he doesn't want to commit to staying in Minnesota, then Bill Guerin has to look to move him. And Alex, the Wild fan base does not believe in Bill Guerin. A majority of the Wild fan base want him gone, but they don't look at the guys that were here before, and the draft pick after draft pick after draft pick of bust of guys you've never heard of. I can't even remember their names because they've never played a game in the NHL. So now you look at what Judd Brackett's done, and you just have to, have faith. Look at the future. Yes, Guerin's made some signings. Frederick Gaudreau for 5 years. The Hartman for 4 years. Foligno, people don't like that he's been re-signed. Zuccarello as well. But the way I look at it is a team will be willing to trade for these guys. Yeah, you may have to do some wheeling and dealing, but just because these guys have no trade and no move clauses doesn't mean that they're untradeable.
Yeah. I'll say this about Minnesota. The hockey writers have them ranked top 5 with their prospect farm system right now. They've got Zeev Buim, the college player waiting in the wings. We mentioned Liam Ogren. You did it, Terry. Marat, who's Nadinov. We'll see how that goes. There's some prospects waiting, and of course Wallstead, the goalie. There's some prospects waiting in the. Yeah, exactly. There's some decent looking prospects on the way for them, but again, it's taken them a while to get to this point. They should have been drafting 5, 6, 7 years ago and not missing so much on these draft picks, but that wasn't the case, and so it set them back a little bit as far as their cupboard. But their cupboard's filling up now, and it's been better the last few years, no doubt. There you go, Minnesota Wild. For the upcoming season, we appreciate everybody tuning in. For Alex B. Smith, and we thank, of course, our friend Terry Edelman for joining us here for the Minnesota Wild preview. I'm Ian Cameron. This has been the Minnesota Wild team preview as 32 teams in 32 days rolls along to get you ready for the upcoming season right here on the Ice Guys.